Hi everyone, this is Charles Joey with Ledgerback, and I am the instructor for the course Introduction to Data Cooperatives. This is Lecture 5, Other Data Stewardship Approaches. Yeah, I'm just going to go over the slides for this lecture. Once again, this is for the Introduction to Data Cooperatives course, which you can find on the Ledgerback Academy website at learn.ledgerback.xyz. If you have any questions, comments, or other feedback, you can send a message to ledgerback@gmail.com. You can also send a DM on Twitter to @ledgerback, or you can submit a post on the Ledgerback forum under the Introduction to Data Cooperatives thread. Anyway, with that in mind, we'll just move on and start with this lecture. Okay. And so for this one, very short readings. This will just kind of briefly go over some other data stewardship approaches. So I think it's important to not only know about data cooperatives, but also other emerging forms for data stewardship. And this way you get to really think about how to design a steward. And I think this might be also helpful in the exercise for building a data steward. Yeah, so first we'll just go over what this means just compared to data governance. We went over this one in lecture 2, and same with exploring legal mechanisms for data stewardship. We went over both in lecture 2, but in lecture 2 we just focused on the data cooperative sections, and this section will go over the other stewardship forms that were mentioned. Okay, so moving on to what does it mean shifting power to data governance. So in this slide, we're just going to briefly go over the 6 institutional forms mentioned in the article other than data cooperatives. So we'll start with the data commons. So first we'll just define data commons. So data commons is really when you have data pooled and shared as a common resource. We also saw similar definitions when we're looking at lecture 3 with what is a data cooperative. So you will see a lot of similar definitions regarding data covers and data commons. Data commons is when data is pooled and shared as a common resource, and generally the goal is to address power imbalances by trying to democratize access to and availability of data. Generally, you'll see a lot of community ownership or some open source principles applied. And this is generally the most popular data stewardship model that was at least found in the real world, and also mentioned in the examples in the database from which this article is based on. And generally you're going to need some responsible stewardship to go along with it. And common reference points looking at the governing principles for commons developed by Eleanor Ostrom. And it's just 8 principles for governing commons. And usually you'll see data commons accompanied with open source licenses. So an example, of course, would also be Wikipedia for data commons, since it's pretty open and you can access it, you can get data, but then it's governed by the Wikimedia Foundation, but also by the contributors to Wikipedia, or I'm forgetting the name for people who work on Wikipedia, but it's also governed by the contributors as well. Okay, so now moving on to the next one. Going to move on to data trust. And we'll tell you a little bit about data trusts and corporate contractual mechanisms in the next slide. So at least how data trusts get defined here is a legal relationship where a trustee stewards data rights and sole interests of a beneficiary or group of beneficiaries. You'll see a similar definition in the next slide. And so that's pretty much the definition. And of course the beneficiaries generally you would expect to be the data subjects, and the trustee manages the data on behalf of of the subjects. The data itself can be really anything, because the trust can really manage any type of asset. And generally, the trustee manages it on the behalf of the data subjects, making sure that it's meets their desires, or depending on the desires of the trust document, could be a purpose, or could just be generally give benefits to the group of beneficiaries. Generally, you'll see data trusts only in common law countries, because you need to have the legal form for a trust for you to create a data trust. And the really interesting part is that with the data trust, you get to establish a fiduciary relationship between the data owner and the data subject. And so that's something that's mentioned in the article, but really the big goal is to create that fiduciary relationship, so that companies that have the data have some fiduciary responsibility to the data suppliers. And so in the case of a trust, the trustee would have the fiduciary relationship with the data subjects and make sure that the data gets used for their benefit. So if the goal is to be economically enriched, then they would do that. If not, then they would do that as well. So that's one of the reasons why data trusts come up a lot. And you'll see in other cases where people mention data trust. I think I might mention this in lecture 1, where people mention data trust. There are many different definitions, but generally what people are trying to establish is that fiduciary relationship between the data supplier and the data user. Also, that's it. Okay. And so that's really what they're trying to establish, is that fiduciary relationship. They might not necessarily be talking about a legal trust, having a legal relationship where you actually have a trustee, the steward, the rights on behalf of beneficiary group beneficiaries. They might not be talking about that at all. They might just be talking about trying to establish a fiduciary relationship. So there's some confusion on the terminology, at least regarding data trusts. Okay, now moving on to data collaborative. So, this is defining data collaboratives. This is a partnership between private and public entities to take, private data and pretty much, share with public entities, so it can be used to inform research or policy. Generally, these are more one-to-one relationships between private entities and public entities, pretty much like a private-public partnerships. And so, really what you're trying to get at here is a way to get this data out of these corporate silos and get them to researchers or members of the public, so that they can use this data to solve public problems or societal problems. And of course, what would be the benefit for companies? It might be easier to do compliance, reciprocity. So I give data, I get that in return. Revenue, so potentially getting paid for giving the data. Might also boost their reputation. Might make them look like they're trying to solve public problems, or it could be that they look more responsible because they're trying to get the data to people who can actually use it for good means, and then that might inform and improve their own data pipelines. But there's a privacy concern as well. Really arising from how the data gets collected and used, especially in a corporate context, and kind of harkening back to the first lecture. I think the article was, I went to the site how their data are used. Really, big concern over the data pipeline, like how do you get this data? And so even if you do have a data collaborative, public-private partnership, the issue might arise. It's like, okay, we have this data, but how did this private entity get this data? And if it might have been unethical or illegal, that might raise concerns for a public entity or a researcher who's using it. And a lot of those issues were mentioned in lecture 1. So that's data collaborative. It's a pretty interesting form, and probably one you'll see very often. Alright, moving on to data fiduciary. Yeah, so data fiduciary pretty much kind of very related to the idea of the data trust, trying to establish a fiduciary relationship And so here, we'll just look at the definition. A data fiduciary is an intermediary between individuals and data collectors, which can take many experimental forms. So, for example, it could just be a data trust. And so it's a really interesting one. Excuse me. That got mentioned. So there were two types really mentioned. There's a legal and technical. So legal, that'd be an information fiduciary. For example, use of fiduciary law to require duty of care toward data subjects. This is coined by Jack M. Balkin and Jonathan Citrain. So that's one way of trying to address some of these power inequities in the data economy. So that can be one way. Another way could be technical. So using technical solutions, so intermediary technology storage solutions that acts as a buffer between people's personal data and commercial entities or online interactions. So this could be like a personal data store. So for example, like Solid from Sir Tim Berners-Lee. Poly also kind of operates a personal data store as well. So there are some technologies which could actually help act as a fiduciary, which would pretty much be the intermediary between commercial entities and technology users. Okay, and then really the big thing is that this approach really recognizes the information asymmetry between really data players and data users. And once again, usually the users usually one providing a technology, while the suppliers usually the one using the technology. And so that's pretty much what this approach is just meant to just really recognize the problem is that it really comes from power asymmetry between really the data suppliers, which would be the users of technology, and then people, the organizations offering the technology, who then grab the personal data and then usually have control over it. And then there are some critiques, really wonder about, so let's take path to structural change. You do have a data fiduciary, will that actually lead to any change? Because, as you mentioned in the article, that this can help empower individuals, but is that something that can, even if you do empower individuals, it's not enough to actually enhance accountability. And then also that some of these see these governance questions more as just as a business opportunity, while not necessarily trying to resolve the core power asymmetry. Okay, so that is the data fiduciary. Moving on to the data marketplace. So we talked about this a little bit in lecture 1 when talking about location data marketplace. So here I'll just define data marketplace. Data marketplace is an approach that enables consumers to sell or trade their personal data for services or other benefits. Of course, there's always a very important question is how do you determine the price of data? Because the price might not necessarily reflect the value. Because once again, you look at the use and reuse of data. And some that's mentioned that location data industry article was the constant use and reuse, and that if it's sold once, it might become more valuable later. So lots of things to consider there. And I thought the article did a pretty good job just talking about some of the questions and criticisms that should arise with that marketplace, because it does sound overall pretty good, because then it recognizes that the data itself is valuable. But of course, just because we recognize that data is valuable, but introducing a marketplace does not necessarily change the power asymmetries between technology providers and technology users. And in other words, data suppliers and data users. And so, I think that's a really good thing about the marketplace, which just kind of makes that clear. But an additional issue that could arise as well is that this might incentivize more data collection of people to give more of their data than necessarily need be, because you're expected to make money, but also you might instead of letting in the goals not necessarily to discourage data sharing, but it's to make it that people still have their privacy. But if you're incentivizing people to share their data, they might be giving up their privacy. So it might lead to actual harm of the individual rather than necessarily the empowerment of the individual. And you can also see this as a further commodification of personal data beyond what's well, actually not necessarily beyond, but it's kind of just reinforcing that core issue of the data economy. So just having a data marketplace in of itself might not necessarily resolve the issues that we have with the data economy. Okay, now moving on to indigenous data sovereignty. So indigenous data sovereignty, defining this indigenous data governance. This is about trying to shift access and control away from governments and other institutions directly to indigenous peoples. And so, since we're talking about data sovereignty, do need to talk about that just a little bit. So it's really just trying to change the relationship between local and national authorities and people subjected to decisions so they can participate directly in community investment decisions. So yeah, just trying to just take away not necessarily take away the data, but provide control over that data to the indigenous peoples, and making sure that the data that's actually used is generally of higher quality to prevent detrimental effects from occurring from bad data. Because if it's garbage in, it's going to be garbage out, and you don't necessarily want to live with those unfortunate ramifications. And that's also an approach that really emphasizes self-determination and justice, because governments in the past have used information and data as a means to subject and control certain populations. So really the goal is really self-determination and justice. And as mentioned in the article, that many indigenous peoples and tribes have tried to gain the rights to have unrestricted access to data and information about themselves and their communities, and also how can they independently own, collect, and govern the use of their own data. So yeah, lots of really interesting things to think about regarding that. And so at that time, that's really interesting, and kind of harkens to the main point about really data stewardship, and really this core issue in the data economy is how do we empower individuals to be able to get the benefits from the use of that, but also have the ability to have governance and say over how the data gets used. And ideally at a collective level, because individually it would be extremely difficult. As I've talked about in previous lectures, going from an individualist standpoint, it's a very difficult way of changing these things, while collectively makes a lot more sense given the nature of data. And there's also a very interesting article that was on Wired regarding the Maori language, and how there's a tech company which is trying to develop a language, the assets of the Maori language, but they want to keep the rights to the Maori themselves. They don't want to just give it to businesses so that they can use it for their own purposes. They want to preserve it specifically for for the Maori people. So that's also an interesting example of indigenous data sovereignty, and showing that data isn't necessarily just about the pure economic issues, but could also be for issues of self-determination and justice, and really making sure that the way this data gets used doesn't necessarily have negative effects on certain populations. So yeah, that's those are all the other data stewardship approaches that I mentioned in this article. What does it mean? Just impact with data governance. Yeah, overall, it's really interesting design space and really something to think about, especially if you're trying to design your own steward. Hopefully you get that try and that build that steward exercise. But yeah, hopefully all of these different approaches hopefully enlighten you on ways you could design a steward and ways that others are working towards developing one, and how they would go about it. Okay, moving on to exploring mechanisms for data stewardship. So this one really goes over data trust and corporate and contractual mechanisms. And so we're going to talk about data trust a little bit earlier, but this article goes way more in depth. So I really did like the problem statement that they mentioned in the article, because it just kind of harkens back to some other problem statements mentioned in the other lectures. So of course the main goal has always been address power inequities, information asymmetries in the data economy. Consent-based framework is inadequate, so once again, notice a consent regime. One-time consents aren't necessarily really good for data, since it can be used and reused in multiple ways. I thought a really interesting problem that I mentioned was that there's a lack of collective institutions for willing data sharing. So there are people who do want to share their data, but it's hard to do that in a collective way. And so I thought that was a really interesting problem statement, and I think that kind of applies to a lot of these other forms of institutional forms for data stewardship as well. Because people definitely do want to share their data, but they really do need to find, we need to develop collective ways of doing that. And of course we have this historical analogy to the feudal system. This one that got mentioned in lecture 1 in the data relations article. It's also something that got mentioned in Prison Data Cooperatives by Alex Sandy Pentland and Thomas Harjano. Hopefully I didn't butcher both their names. But as you can see, everyone keeps mentioning this in their problem statement. It's the fact that we are in this historical analogy. I know in the Prison Data Cooperatives article, they talked more about this one between the current issues in data economy and the Gilded Age, but you also see a similar, historical analogy here between what's going on in data economy and the feudal system, because that's where trust really arose at that time. But you can see people harkening back to previous incidences where there was this, or these power asymmetries or information asymmetries also existed, and some of the tools people developed to address them. Alright, then we look at the definition of a data trust in this article. Data trust is a proposed mechanism for individuals to take the data rights that are set out in law, or the beneficial interest in those rights, and pool these into an organization, a trust, which trustees would exercise the data rights conferred by the law on behalf of the trust beneficiaries. This is pretty much the same as the definition given in the previous slide. Yeah, really not too much difference. Much rather that I would say that this one just is a little bit more explicit about what the rights are, because you have to put rights or assets in a trust, and so I like this section, but it's just a little bit more explicit. I went to the next point: trust. All the trustees and data rights. So you have a data trust. What would the trustee deal with? It's unfortunately a good amount. You then have to deal with stewarding the assets, which would probably be data. Then that could also be the means for storing the data. So it could be technical infrastructure as well. So some things to think about there. Negotiating on behalf of beneficiaries. So the trustee has the data, and now they have to negotiate on on the behalf of beneficiaries with third parties. This could be corporations, this could be researchers, it could be government, on how this data is supposed to be used and shared. Also, they have the fiduciary responsibility to beneficiaries. This was mentioned a little bit in the previous slide with the data fiduciary and with the definition of data trust, but that's really important point is having that fiduciary responsibility, which means you have to act in the best interest of the beneficiaries. Which leads to the last point, which is that you can also be taken to court by the beneficiaries for malfeasance. That's the other really important point of having a fiduciary responsibility, is that you can also be taken to court or have legal action acted against a trustee if they misuse the data beneficiaries. So a trust can be flexibly designed. There's lots of different ways to design trust depending on what you're trying to accomplish. So there's many different ways you could design a data trust. A trust can hold pretty much any right or assets. So yeah, as I said before, trusts are very flexible. So you can put any right or asset in there. And what's going to data trust? Of course, the question is, what are you actually putting in the trust? Is it the data? Is it the beneficial rights to the data? Is it just the technical storage means of the data? Lots to think about. And then another thing pointed out as well in the article is how is that do you exercise rights on behalf of beneficiaries? So interesting points raised was what's the interaction between trade secrets and other IP rights, because at least in some countries data is not protected by intellectual property rights, and so it's sometimes to be protected as a trade secret. So how do you bring those two together? Then that changes how you're supposed to exercise those rights. And then additionally, how do you handle when data transitions from personal data to non-personal data? How do you know when that actually happens? Because you might have non-personal data, but then that might get coupled with a couple of other data points, which then can infer the identity of a person. So then from there, this become personal. And if it's personal data, there are different requirements on how you manage that compared with non-personal data. So lots of future research to think about with data trust. And then going to the main goal of a data trust is to create value from data as an asset, rather than manage an already viable asset as in a traditional trust. Usually with traditional trust, if something is already of value, you would put it in there. But with data, the goal is to create value from it. So, instead of just maintaining an asset, the trustee would have to be actively trying to create value from it, as either economically or non-economically. So that's quite a change up from what a traditional trustee would do. And then you'd also have to worry about data portability, which is the fact that data can move in and out of the trust. While the traditional trust, this is really less of an issue, because if we put land in the trust, like the land can't move. Or if I have like intellectual property or copyrights, I put copyrights, my rights under copyright into a trust, like the rights can't move. But with data though, since data is portable, let's say I want to join a data trust and I put my data in a data trust, and I say, I just want to move it to another data trust. Okay, now I have to deal with how can you transfer this data from this data trust to another data trust or to another organization, or if the person also has a personal data store and they use the data trust as another data storage means, you have that in two places. How do you handle that? So lots of interesting things to think about with data trust and how a trust itself can actually manage data. Okay, moving on to corporate and contractual mechanisms. This one has somewhat of the same vibe as data marketplace. But this is usually a little bit more direct relationships. So defining corporate and contractual mechanisms, this means to facilitate data sharing between parties for a defined set of aims or an agreed purpose. You need usually this would, as it says, corporate and contractual mechanisms, this is usually just creating an an actual contractual agreement between one or more parties, and everyone just agrees to the terms. So yeah, this is also another way of doing things. So you might not necessarily need to create an intermediary if you can just have everyone agree to the same terms. So something else to think about. However, you probably still gonna need an independent steward because, as mentioned in the article, you have to create that trusted environment for stakeholders to be comfortable sharing their data with third parties who they don't, who are untrusted. They might not know a lot about them. So that's where the independent steward really come in, is to create the environment for data sharing. And so the independent steward would actually manage all of that, so that people actually follow the mechanisms. And then they mentioned their recommended approach. You have to overcome challenges sharing data. So what are the challenges sharing data, making sure that those can be overcome. Secondly, there should be a clearly defined purpose. We're going to create these kind of mechanisms. There should be a clear reason why you're doing it. Because if it's vague, that can lead to issues of trust between parties, and also on how the steward itself can remain independent. Establish a set of rules. This would be something that you would have in the contractual agreements, determining how that's supposed to be collected, stored, analyzed, shared. Most of those things should all be, should be defined. And then you should also determine a formal relationship or legal personality, so that way the independent steward is not considered either one of the actual parties to the agreement itself, or given the appearance as working as an agent of one of them, but keeping the independent steward to have its own legal personality, or the term for relationship. This could just also be a joint venture between multiple entities. That way, once you have that formal relationship, you don't have to deal with burgeoning questions like, okay, I share this data, but what can this person do with my data? Are they going to share it with other people? You get this formal relationship, you know what people are going to account for, but also you get the availability of legal recourse. And then lastly, there are also considerations for data steward, data providers, and data users. And so regarding the data provider considerations, first and foremost, you gotta make it attractive for data providers to want to share their data, and hopefully there's not too much risk. So, creating that environment for people to share that, and then how do you manage the rights? And for a user, of course, ideally that would be of sufficient quality, and hopefully not too expensive. And also, you want some protections against unlawful use of the data. And for the steward, really what it considers, how do you make decisions and grant access to the data provider's data to the approved data users? How do you make sure and manage all of that? So, a lot to think about there. But going back to the challenges, what are some of the challenges? I mean, there's actually a good amount that you would have to really overcome. So, of course, the first and foremost one is that you have a lot of untrusted parties. So, depending on if you're in a highly competitive sector, you might have people not want to share their intellectual property or confidential information. People might not want to show that they have poor quality or limited data sets. People might not want to breach confidentiality agreements or competition rules, or possibly violate privacy regulations. Additionally, there could be a lack of knowledge of best and also support data sharing. I also have the potential benefits of data sharing. There might be a lack of technical resources to implement data sharing. And of course, security risks as well. Those are always present when you're trying to share data. So that's pretty much it. Regarding the corporate and contractual mechanisms. If you have any questions, comments, or other feedback, please send an email to ledgerback@gmail.com, a DM to @ledgerback on Twitter, or post post a message on the Ledgerback forum under the Introduction to Data Cooperatives thread, and we'll try to get to you as quickly as possible. Once again, there's your instructor. Trust you. I'm just going giving a little voiceover for the slides. Hopefully you enjoyed this quick little video. Hopefully this should be helpful in thinking about the next section, which is the exercise for building Data Steward. Hopefully this is helpful to you in developing one, and I hope you found the slides to be helpful, and the videos as well, and understanding the materials.